She was young, Austrian, and hidden in plain sight. Constanze Manziarly, Hitler's personal cook and dietitian. She prepared his strict vegetarian meals, poured his teas, and stood silently as he unraveled in paranoia during those final bunker days. Then she vanished, gone without a trace. For decades, her story was buried, but now, recently uncovered letters finally reveal what it was really like to serve inside the most evil household in history. Hitler's obsessions, his private fears, his terrifying habits at the table. But who was this mysterious woman who dared to serve history's greatest monster, and what drove her to stay until the very end? The innocent Austrian who became Hitler's keeper of secrets. Constanze Manziarly's story begins far from the madness of Berlin's bunkers. She was born on April 14, 1920, in Innsbruck, Austria, surrounded by mountains and quiet streets. Nothing in her early years suggested she would one day stand beside Adolf Hitler during his final days. She wasn't raised as a fanatic. She didn't grow up dreaming of power or ideology. She was just a young Austrian girl who wanted to teach children, live a simple life, and carve out a future for herself. But the world she was born into didn't allow simple dreams to last long. Constanze trained as a dietitian, a practical career at the time, something that would give her stability when teaching didn't work out. It seemed harmless enough: food, health, helping people live better. What she didn't know was that this choice would open a door into history's darkest household. By 1943, she was 23 years old, full of life, and looking for work. She answered what looked like an ordinary job posting. But this job wasn't ordinary at all. It was a position as a dietitian working for the Führer himself. Imagine being that age, applying for a job you think is about food and health, and suddenly finding yourself standing in front of Adolf Hitler. She was chosen because she was young, skilled, and healthy. Most importantly, she was untainted by ideology. She didn't have a long political past. She wasn't deeply tied to the Nazi machine. That made her safe in Hitler's eyes. And just like that, with one signature, she was pulled into a world she never asked for. Constanze became Hitler's personal cook and dietitian, responsible for maintaining his rigid vegetarian diet. Hitler had obsessive fears about his health and was convinced that meat would harm him. Constanze carefully prepared his meals, vegetables, grains, soups, always under strict instructions. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't powerful, it was routine. But it was a routine wrapped in paranoia, because she wasn't just cooking for any man. She was cooking for the most feared man on earth. And here's where her innocence collides with history. Constanze wasn't there to plot, or to march, or to shout slogans. She was there because of the food. Yet food meant everything to Hitler. His diet was part of his identity, part of his control, and part of his myth. Constanze wasn't just feeding him, she was keeping him alive. That made her both vital and vulnerable. Think about it. She was 23 years old, standing in the center of evil, surrounded by men twice her age who had blood on their hands. She wasn't armed, she wasn't powerful. Her weapons were a wooden spoon and a saucepan. But in that twisted household, even food was political. Every dish she prepared had to be perfect. Every mistake could mean suspicion or worse. Constanze later admitted she always felt as if she had one foot in the grave. She feared poisoning accusations. She feared slipping up. And yet, she stayed. Why? Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was fear of what would happen if she left. Or maybe, like so many caught in the Nazi machine, she realized too late that there was no easy escape. The strangest part is that she wasn't a Nazi zealot. She wasn't one of those who lived and breathed ideology. She was a young woman who applied for the wrong job at the wrong time. And once she was inside, she became Hitler's keeper of secrets, not by choice, but by circumstance. She saw his paranoia up close, the private moments, and the carefully crafted diet that was supposed to protect him from sickness, while the world outside collapsed into chaos. Constanze's story forces us to ask, how does someone so ordinary get pulled into history's most extraordinary evil? How does a girl who wanted to be a teacher end up serving the dictator whose decisions destroyed millions of lives? It's easy to think we'd never make the same choices, but if you were 23, living in a country at war, and offered a stable job, would you have known to say no? Would you have seen the trap? Her life is a chilling reminder that history isn't only shaped by generals and politicians. Sometimes it's shaped by quiet figures in the background, the ones who never intended to be there. And for Constanze, being in the background meant standing in a front row seat to evil. But as the war turned darker, so did life in Hitler's household. Constanze's letters reveal details that historians long ignored: the fear, the claustrophobia, the horror of serving a man who trusted no one. The question is, what did she see inside those walls when Hitler's world began to collapse? Letters from hell, inside Hitler's paranoid kitchen. For years, historians wondered what it must have been like to serve Hitler up close. And then, in 2017, the silence finally cracked. German historian Stefan Dietrich unearthed a set of forgotten letters Constanze Manziarly had written to her sister. These weren't political reports or propaganda pamphlets. They were private confessions. And in them, Constanze painted a chilling picture of life inside Hitler's paranoid kitchen. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a woman who was trapped in terror. "I encounter unimaginable difficulties that I cannot even report," she wrote. "Imagine being so afraid that you can't even explain what's happening in your own letters home." That was Constanze's reality. Hitler's vegetarian obsession was at the center of her nightmare. Day after day, he demanded strict meals: millet with linseed oil, grated apples, chopped mushrooms, and endless bowls of vegetable soup. He believed meat would poison his body, yet the irony is that he lived in constant fear that every dish might be poisoned anyway. Constanze confessed that she always felt she had one foot in the grave while preparing his meals. Think about that for a moment. Most of us cook for comfort, to feed family or friends. But Constanze cooked under suspicion. Every plate was a test of loyalty, every ingredient a risk. If Hitler thought she'd slipped, even by mistake, it could cost her everything. And it wasn't just the food. It was the atmosphere. Hitler often launched into rage-filled monologues while she worked nearby. Constanze described how he would rant about Jews in violent, frenzied bursts, pounding tables, his voice echoing through the room. The fury was so intense she remembered him literally crashing into cakes she had baked. Imagine the psychological whiplash. One moment you're whisking sugar into cream, the next moment, your boss, the most feared dictator on earth, is screaming about racial conspiracies and destroying your work with his bare hands. In one letter, Constanze wrote that she felt surrounded by unimaginable difficulties. What did she mean by that? Was it the paranoia of cooking for a man who trusted no one? Was it the claustrophobia of knowing escape was impossible? Or was it the daily psychological torment of watching Hitler's madness at close range? Whatever she meant, those words revealed how her job wasn't just about food, it was about surviving. These letters rip away the sanitized image of Hitler as a disciplined man with a simple diet. They show him as a tyrant whose paranoia infected even the smallest details of everyday life. He micromanaged his meals, terrified that poison might find its way onto his plate, while ignoring the fact that his own policies had turned Europe into a graveyard. Constanze's letters make something else clear too. She wasn't just a cook, she was a witness. She saw Hitler not on the podium or in propaganda photos, but in the kitchen, where his obsessions and fears couldn't be hidden. She experienced the suffocating pressure of his paranoia, and she carried that truth in her words. And here's the haunting question. What do you do when you realize the man you serve is evil, but leaving could mean death? Constanze never had an answer. Instead, she poured her sorrows into letters that sounded like diary entries from hell. She was only in her 20s, but she spoke with the weariness of someone who was almost twice her age. Her confessions remind us that power doesn't just crush only nations. It crushes mostly individuals, one by one, until even the act of cooking becomes unbearable. But the story doesn't end with Hitler's kitchen, because as the Allies closed in and Berlin began to burn, Constanze found herself trapped in the most infamous bunker in history. And what happened in those final days would haunt her forever. So the question is, when the walls of the bunker started closing in, what role did Constanze play in Hitler's last stand? And what became of her when the Third Reich finally collapsed? The bunker's final secret: cooking for the dead. By January 1945, Constanze Manziarly found herself sealed into a tomb disguised as the Führer bunker. 20 feet underground, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and fear. Supplies were dwindling fast. The meals she once prepared with precision now looked more like survival rations. Potatoes grew moldy, canned goods were rationed down to scraps, and even Hitler's famously rigid vegetarian diet became harder to maintain. Imagine it. You're in your mid-20s, once responsible for carefully prepared vegetarian dishes, and suddenly you're cutting mold off carrots and boiling whatever is left. Above ground, Berlin was collapsing into rubble. Underground, the walls shook with every Allied shell, while inside, Hitler's circle clung to routine as if repeating the motions of daily life could ward off the inevitable. Constanze kept cooking because that was the only way to survive. She wrote of the suffocating tension, of silence broken by the thud of bombs, and of eyes watching her every move in the kitchen. Every meal mattered because every meal reminded Hitler's inner circle that for now, their leader was still alive. Then came April 22, 1945. Hitler gathered his closest staff and admitted, for the first time, that the war was lost. That day, he handed out cyanide capsules one by one to his inner circle. He personally pressed one into Constanze's hand. Think about that. Hitler, the dictator who trusted almost no one, gave his cook the very poison meant to ensure a clean death. He was offering her a way out. She could have walked away, but she didn't. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or simple paralysis, she chose to stay, and that decision sealed her fate. 1 week later, on April 30th, Hitler prepared for his final act. That afternoon, Constanze prepared what would become his last meal: fried eggs with mashed potatoes and a simple vegetable side. Nothing extravagant, just a plate of comfort food served in the heart of a crumbling empire. At the table, Constanze sat with Hitler, his secretary Traudl Junge, and Gerda Christian. Imagine the silence. Imagine the clinking of forks against plates, everyone pretending to eat while the world outside ended. Hours later, the gunshot rang out. Hitler was dead. The man Constanze had served for 2 years, the man who defined her every waking moment in that bunker, was gone. But her most chilling task was still ahead. Because Hitler's body may have been lifeless, but the illusion of his control had to remain alive. Constanze was ordered to prepare another meal after his death. A posthumous plate, carefully arranged to deceive those who hadn't yet been told. She cooked for a corpse. She laid out food meant not for nourishment, but for theater, maintaining the illusion that the Führer still lived below ground while his empire crumbled above. Stop for a second and picture that. Cooking for the dead, pretending everything was normal when nothing was. The smell of eggs still in the air, the sound of distant artillery, the knowledge that she was preparing food no one would eat. That psychological horror is almost impossible to grasp. Constanze stayed at her station silent, watching the nightmare unfold. She could have swallowed the cyanide. She could have slipped away in the chaos. But instead, she kept serving, kept pretending, and kept moving through the motions of a routine that no longer made sense. And it makes you wonder, what does it do to a person to play along with a lie that big? When the Soviets finally closed in and the bunker began to collapse, Constanze's role as Hitler's cook was over, but her real nightmare was just beginning. Because after that final meal for the dead, Constanze Manziarly walked out of history and into one of World War II's greatest unsolved mysteries. So the question is, when the bunker finally fell and she stepped into the ruins of Berlin, what happened to Hitler's cook? Did she escape with the others, vanish into the chaos, or was she silenced forever? The Vanishing, a mystery that haunts history. On May 1st, 1945, the bunker finally broke open. General Wilhelm Mohnke led a desperate breakout group of nearly 40 people, including secretaries, guards, doctors, and Hitler's most loyal staff. Constanze Manziarly, the cook who had just prepared meals for the dead, was among them. Berlin was burning above their heads, and now they were marching into a city crawling with Soviet troops. The group tried to slip past Russian lines under the cover of night. Their destination was simple: escape west and surrender to the Americans. The problem was that the Red Army was everywhere. By the time they reached the Schultheiss Patzenhofer brewery, they were surrounded. The Soviets stormed in, guns raised, shouting orders. The Germans had no choice. They dropped their weapons and fell into captivity. But it was inside that brewery where Constanze's story took its final turn. The women in the group, including Traudl Junge, Hitler's secretary, realized their SS uniforms made them targets. Soviet soldiers weren't interested in who had been a cook or a typist. To them, anyone in a uniform was the enemy. So Constanze, still wearing her Wehrmacht jacket, went searching for civilian clothes. It was her last act of preparation, as if stripping away the jacket could strip away her connection to Hitler. Then came the moment burnt into history. Traudl Junge later recalled it. She saw Constanze being approached by two Soviet soldiers. They gestured toward the U-Bahn subway tunnels and told her to come with them. Constanze looked back, calm, and said, "They want to see my papers." That was the last anyone ever saw of her. She walked into the tunnel with the soldiers, and then she was gone. On May 2nd, 1945, Constanze Manziarly vanished. Nobody was ever found. No grave, no record, just silence. And that silence has haunted historians for nearly 80 years. What really happened to Hitler's cook? The theories are chilling. Some say she was executed immediately, another nameless casualty of Soviet revenge. Others whispered that she may have swallowed the cyanide capsule Hitler gave her, preferring death on her own terms rather than capture. There's a darker theory too, that she was assaulted and killed in the chaos, her body lost in the rubble of Berlin. But there's also the possibility, slim yet intoxicating, that Constanze survived, that she shed her jacket, assumed a false name, and disappeared into the ashes of post-war Europe. Could she have lived out her days quietly in Austria? Or maybe even fled abroad, carrying with her the memories of Hitler's final meals? The truth is, we don't know. And maybe that's why her story lingers. Because Constanze Manziarly wasn't a general or a propaganda minister. She wasn't one of the infamous Nazi names carved into history books. She was a cook, an ordinary young woman pulled into extraordinary evil. And yet, her silence, her disappearance, feels almost symbolic. She represents what it means to be complicit, to survive in the machinery of a regime without pulling its levers but still keeping it fed. Her meals may not have won battles, but they kept the man who started the war alive day after day. That's why her vanishing unsettles us. If someone so close to Hitler could simply evaporate into history, then what does that say about all the others who kept the machine running? The secretaries, the drivers, the guards. How many of them disappeared, their stories untold, their choices buried beneath rubble. And here's the haunting part. Today, almost 80 years later, we're still left asking questions. Did Constanze die in that tunnel? Her story ending in a few unmarked seconds of violence? Or did she live, carrying the unbearable weight of being Hitler's cook, forced to conceal her past for the rest of her life? Her story doesn't give us answers. It gives us a mirror, because Constanze's fate isn't just about one vanished woman. It's about what happens when ordinary people are caught in extraordinary evil, and whether silence makes them guilty or makes them victims. And that's why her disappearance matters. Constanze Manziarly forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes history doesn't close its doors neatly. Sometimes it leaves them wide open, with shadows spilling out. So here's the question that lingers, the one that keeps historians awake. Was Constanze Manziarly swallowed by the chaos of war, or did she outlive the Reich, walking among us under another name, her secret hidden forever? Constanze's disappearance continues to cast a long shadow over history. Some believe that they saw her board a train in Bavaria, while others claim that she was captured and silenced. But nobody was ever found, no grave ever marked. She simply vanished. And that silence is almost louder than any confession. Did she escape and live under a false name? Or did she meet a darker end that the world was never told about? What do you think really happened to Hitler's cook? And if you were in her shoes, would you have stayed loyal or run? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.